Hello everybody and welcome to session 4 of 4 of the e-sgol history sessions. Leading this evening's session is Mr. Penny, and you can find all recordings of the e-sgol catch-up sessions by following the link in the Q&A section. If you have any questions, please ask them there and we'll get back to you. Over to you, Mr. Penny.
Thank you very much. Right, hello everybody. As you can see from this screen, I'm going to focus on two topics or two study units again, Nazi Germany and USA in the 1910 to 29. In particular, I'm going to focus on 4 types of questions from the typical Unit 2 papers. Predominantly, it will be source work, as you can see from the front screen. So I can start by looking at a question 1, source and knowledge question, which you'll be accustomed to, I'm sure, and it's questions which I have raised already in the previous session 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to start with looking at this one. It's a question from the USA topic, using the source and your own knowledge to describe the car industry during the 1920s. Now, clearly, a source question like this requires 2 elements. Your discussion of your knowledge, but also just as important, your discussion of what you see from the source. What does the source tell you? What does the source infer? And you'll notice for every source, I have placed at the bottom of the page the location where the source originated from. I always think that for source questions, there's plenty of material available in the little annotation box. In this source, I've left the annotation in the bottom left-hand side, an assembly line for the Ford Motor Company. So if you all just take a few seconds to look at this source, you'll spot about 3 or 4 things already, I'd like to think. So give yourself a few seconds to quickly inspect the source. This source would be a 6-mark question. So if we just focus on the source in a little bit more detail, we will see a number of things already. The assembly line is used where you have a major number of workers on display here. If you look closer, each area has a specialized unit where they are making different parts of the car, and then the car then travels along the conveyor belt or an assembly line or a gravity slide to the next specialized unit. So you get the impression that car production would be faster as a result. What else can we see? Large factory. It implies that the Ford motor car industry is a large industry and it's growing in numbers. You get the impression that it's also a major employer at the time. You get the impression that it's a specialized unit. For example, I picked out a few points here with regards to the source content. Number 1, I said it was a major employer. For example, the Ford garages. The annotation implies that industries utilize machinery and assembly lines to improve and indeed speed up production. I also pointed out a few seconds ago that it's there to have specialized units. I called it here specific areas or stations to aid production. So there's a few elements you could have picked out from the source content itself. If we move forward a little, what else could we have included in this answer? So in addition to the content, what do we also recognize? So in the answer, you might record it as being in addition or furthermore, firstly, secondly, thirdly. So using my knowledge, I picked out these points. These industries, such as Ford, introduced mass production to improve efficiency and raise the numbers, as in raise numbers of cars being built. They improve specialization and speed of the production process. So as you can see, I'm starting to name drop here and introduce examples from my knowledge. You can also see standardization here. This clearly reduced unit costs, because if producers are buying thousands of gallons of items or liters of items like paint and so many sheets of glass, then obviously their unit prices drop. So they're able to charge lower prices to the good old American consumer. This would clearly have a positive impact on demand for the consumer goods. So these lower prices and increased demand results in a rise in profit. I always like to use the phrase the boom spiral. So if workers buy more goods, the producers have to make more goods. To make more goods, they employ more workers. These workers then have money and wages to process and buy new consumer goods, and so on and on. Other examples here, the positive impact on other industries, e.g. other groups of industries use similar production methods to aid the process. Demand for other products, of course, e.g. paint, glass and leather. So all of these have a positive multiplier effect on other industries. So I'd like to think that gives us a good understanding of the source itself, where we zoomed in and picked out issues from the source, from the content. We also utilized the annotation, which is in the bottom left corner in this case. We used this and wrote it in our own words, or translated into our own words, without relying too much on the vocab or the messages in the annotation. And then we used our own additional knowledge, didn't we, to arrive at a very good answer. So that's a typical question 1. I'm also going to look at another question 1 from the Germany module now. Using the source and your knowledge, describe education in Nazi Germany. Usually it would give you a date. It would say 1933 to 39, for example, to allow you to specialize in a certain period of history. So let's have a look. First of all, what does it tell us in the source? Now, if we zoom in a little, we all take a few seconds to scan this. We'll probably spot a few items already. The item that stands out to me is the cruel treatment of the 2 Jewish children who were singled out to the class, aren't they? And the rest of the children, who we can assume are Aryan children, watch on and see the treatment of these Jewish children and the messages on the board to stress anti-Semitic views. And that is, of course, seen in the use of the Star of David. So we found probably about 3 examples there, didn't we, from the content alone. Now, if we go back a little bit, we look at the annotation, Jewish children being identified to highlight differences. You might say that the source illustrates that Jews are being identified in the classroom so that Aryan children can notice how different Jews are perceived to be in relation to the Aryan children. So it shows the cruel treatment of minority groups. So from that alone, I concluded a few things from the source. Identified to highlight, it shows the mistreatment of minority groups, seen as inferior to other pupils, and of course the symbol to identify them as what they are. According to many German people, they are Jews. In the harsh language of the Nazi party, they're identified and they're seen as Jews and nothing else in this case. So that was a bit of a window in terms of what we saw from the content. So we used the annotation and we used the source content to describe what we see about education. Now we think, what do we know? How can we include our own prior knowledge on education in Nazi Germany, 33 to 39? For example, you could include 2 or 3 other points. In this case, I've given you about 5 points. Number 1, look at our historical language. They're trying to brainwash pupils, to indoctrinate. It's used to spread Nazi ideology and to influence the young, to make them a powerful machine or powerful weapon for the Nazi regime. This is an alliance, of course, to the Hitler Youth movement, or movements even. I made the point here that schools and the curriculum are there to be Nazified, to make them Nazi-like, basically, to aid Hitler's process of control and, of course, indoctrination, which I've said already. Lessons, as you know, had a key focus on key themes which Hitler wanted to spread to German people. Issues like war, conquest, race, struggle, hatred, anti-Semitism, support for the Führer. I could go on and on, couldn't I? Also, we could talk about certain examples of lessons like race studies, or how history and geography were manipulated to show typical Nazi ideologies. A geography lesson could talk about, for example, land lost at the Treaty of Versailles following World War I. I also made the point here that you could have discussed elite schools, which the intention was, of course, to create future Nazi leaders. So that was a typical question 1 again. So source was utilized well, and then we brought in some knowledge as well. If you note this, I never once talked about, is the source useful? I never once discussed, is the source biased or exaggerating? I never once mentioned that it could be a form of propaganda, because for question 1, our focus is on 2 things. Let's go back to the question. The focus is on use the source and use your knowledge. This is what we've done. So they are typical question 1s. Now I have got another question 1, which I might come back to later if time permits. But considering I've spent time on 2 questions already, and I want to move forward to question 3. Question 2 in history assessments tends to be describe question, describe something worth 8 marks. But we're going to jump ahead to number 3. This is more of a critical analysis question. In this one, it asks you, what was the purpose of this source? An 8-mark question. Basically, why was it made? What was the purpose? What was the agenda? What was the rationale behind the creation of this poster? And I've indicated at the bottom of the page where the source originated from, where on the internet it originated from, sorry. And I've included the brief annotation. So if we all spend a few seconds again looking at this source, and we're going to try and pick out about 4 or 5 points that stand out, because the content can tell us so much as to why it was made. I can see instantly about 4 or 5 little hints here on why the source was produced. And give you an extra 5 seconds to arrive at a few answers. Remember, any questions you have, please post, or any points you want to identify to us, please do so. So here we are. What is the purpose? A few things we'd look for. What is the rationale, the origins of the source, the nature, what type of source it is. If it's propaganda, you would say so. It's a form of propaganda, try to indoctrinate people. How is the source written, as in the tone? What is the audience of the source? What does the source tell us, content-wise? And what do we bring in from our own knowledge, our context? And one of Sir's favourites, JEEP. Justify, educate, entertain, and persuade. I can promise you, most sources you will ever see, usually at least 2 of the 4 can be discussed from the source alone. I can certainly see 2 here. I'm sure you can as well. So what did we spot? From the source alone, why was it created? Now, we don't start the answer with the source tells us that. We certainly don't start with the source is useful because it. We're going to start with the point. The source, its purpose is as follows. Well, the purpose of the source was to. The rationale behind the source was to this. Well, according to the source itself, why is it made? Right, bottom of the page, KDF wagon, KDF car. So it wants to generate support for the KDF. It wants to raise the profile of strength through joy, which is the KDF. If we look at the picture, it is clearly a form of Nazi propaganda to indoctrinate. to persuade, to encourage, to create support. So it's there to raise publicity for the Nazis and the KDF. Look at the poster again. It's trying to show the positives, isn't it? E.g., showing great scenes, the chance to purchase a brand new car, a people's car, as the title says. It's trying to show to you that the method is certainly one which is accessible. Saving stamps, what could be easier in terms of how to create money and save up for a car? It also shows mountains, as in lovely scenery, which then are a form of excitement for many Germans. To make it look like the ownership of a car is an easy thing to do. It's accessible. So if I go back to the left side, look at my third point down, create an excitement for the initiative. The fifth point down, the tone of the source, is trying to show a positive aspect. It's trying to stress how exciting the opportunity is. Now we're going to focus on our friend Jeep. Perhaps one motive is to educate people on the merits of the KDF scheme. To stress the ownership of cars is a key feature here. It's a straightforward method, accessible for all. Even people with a relatively low wage or an average wage. Maybe it's to persuade from Jeep of the benefits of supporting the party and the benefits of joining this infamous Nazi community. To foster a sense of togetherness. Then you might consider the audience. Is it aimed at Nazi supporters, maybe? Trying to encourage people to be more devoted to the regime? Is it aimed at party members to encourage greater loyalty? Then you will have the benefits. As you know, usually the main benefits of KDF were given to people who were active members of the regime, or active members of the party. Or is it aimed at ordinary Germans who could be persuaded to support the party? People who are maybe having negative thoughts about the regime when they hear about the excesses of the regime. So maybe this is seen as a way to win over doubters to the regime. So all that was from the source. You might have thought of 3 or 4 of these. Now, what did I include from my knowledge then? So the purpose of the source was to. Now, a very good answer would integrate the content and the knowledge together. So we said that the purpose was to raise awareness of the benefits the regime offers, to secure loyalty to the Führer, to Hitler. Maybe it's a heavy emphasis on promotion, to encourage a greater level of support and participation in the Nazi community. Maybe the purpose or the rationale is to create a community spirit, that people are happy. If you look at the final point here, maybe the motive is to indoctrinate. Maybe it's a mechanism of control, remove the potential for opposition towards Hitler. Remember, the Nazi party worked out how many hours a week or a year was spent on work and sleep, etc. They worked out how many hours are left over for leisure. If you remove obstacles in this leisure time, you remove the possibility of people rebelling, don't you? Maybe you could have talked about some extra examples of what the KDF offers. If you go up a little bit in the page, the German Labour Front offered other aspects, and the KDF, of course, improved working conditions, adult classes, ski trips, subsidised holidays, even trips abroad often, theatre visits, sports events. So the KDF offers a variety of positives to the people. And this source has a motive to encourage people to foster a love for the KDF scheme. And central to that, of course, is the image of the car in terms of the car saving scheme. So you might have had, say, 4 thoughts from the source and 4 ideas from your mind as to why this was created. So that was a typical question 3, an 8-mark question. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time on number 4. Which of the 2 sources is most useful to an historian studying the lives of Black Americans? So I've chosen 2 sources from Key Issue 2 from the USA course. I've also included the annotation. It tells us so much, doesn't it? I'm guessing that you would want to address both sources. You may well do one at a time and then have a conclusion at the end. And at the end, try to have some judgment on which you think is most useful and why, of course. So I've tried to dissect each source for you. And I'm going to focus on a number of issues for each of the 2 sources. For the first source, I'm going to look at, as you can see in my color coding, I will focus on content and origin of the source. Look at the annotation. There's a few clues here in terms of the origin of the source, which might help you to address, is it a useful source or not? I will start by the content, though. Now, I would say an answer should not start with a sentence. The source tells me that. The source shows that. I would say that's quite an ordinary start. So maybe start with the phrase, it is useful source. It has its uses. It is a valid source because it. If we focus on the content first, I picked out about 4 or 5 themes here that I thought we could expand on. So if you all just quickly look at those phrases that I've put in blue or purple, whatever color it is, and hopefully you can expand on some of these quite easily. So I've tried to expand on some of these. Like the first sentence discusses the dirt floor, windows without glass. So it highlights dreadful conditions and difficulties they face. So I tried to match it up on the right side, like poverty, conditions. Then they talk about the realities of life in the South, and that life in the North is better than in the South. Maybe this explains why there was a great migration during this time, as in movement north. Third point, I said, it provides evidence of the harsh inequalities in the South. And where did I get that from? The last sentence. Some poor white man won't get his gang together and come around and drive him out. So it's saying that the reality is white groups, such as the infamous KKK, may end up victimizing and brutally treating Black Americans. So I've expanded on the points there in the source. I've tried not to use the vocab in the source too much. I've tried to add to it, haven't I? I've also brought in some of the context, some of my supportive knowledge. So what about origin? Look at origin now. Who wrote it and why? I've only included a few brief points here, but I've said it has utility, it has its use. It illustrates a contemporary perspective of the realities. Personally, I'm not a fan of the phrases primary and secondary evidence. So maybe contemporary or eyewitness account is a better phrase to use. So it should have a contemporary perspective of the realities of life. Should be a valuable source. It is a newspaper. Should benefit from research, the insider knowledge. Should benefit from interviews with people who've experienced it. It should have factual support. Should have author's arguments which are substantiated by evidence, you could argue. If you look at the annotation again, newspaper for Black Americans in 1921, you could argue that perhaps the source had a motive here. Maybe it's trying to generate support for the issue. Maybe it's trying to expand its readership at this time to raise a higher audience for the newspaper here. So I've deliberately picked on 2 of the 3 themes I discussed, and I briefly discussed the third one, as in purpose or provenance as well, I've discussed. Now I want to spend a few minutes looking at the second source. Here I'm Wesley Evans, the leader of the KKK. I'm expecting, in terms of origin and purpose, in your minds, a few alarm bells are ringing already, aren't they? The leader of the KKK, so maybe he's got a motive for saying it. Maybe there's a purpose here. Maybe he has an agenda. If you look at the language in the source, you can see there is certainly an agenda here on behalf of the KKK member. So what about the content? So I'm not going to use the same language. I will at times I will refer to the source, but I've also tried to add a little bit in. It perhaps has utility that it demonstrates the leader's beliefs in white supremacy and the refusal to accept mixed race relationships. You would say, for example, he talks about banning sex between whites and black people this time. It is useful as it provides evidence of the racist ideology, racist ideas he has, and its rejection of foreigners, as seen in the attitude shown towards non-WASPs. WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. I'm sure you all remember that one. So white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So there's the intolerance against non-WASPs. The source also discusses the KKK and the insistence on struggle and its acceptance of persecution and violence and hatred. That's where you might bring in some details. This is supported by the examples such as the lynching of victims, castration, floggings against its victims. You might say that there are other groups who they targeted. But as you can see, the question is focusing on the lives of Black Americans here. So in that case, I've discussed the content and how we expand on the content. What about the purpose of the source? This might affect its usefulness. This might affect how much we value the source. It can perhaps be regarded as useful as it provides details of the origin of the source and is recorded during a period of growth. At a time when KKK numbers were so high. Estimates at this time certainly do vary. Some estimates are as high as 2 million, some are even more than that. The purpose must be considered, I've said there, as it clearly has a motive to raise support for the organisation and to encourage racist ideas and actions. The rationale is to push people towards hatred and racism. It has limitations, of course. It's a one-sided perspective, isn't it? Often students use the phrase bias without really explaining it. It's a one-sided perspective which clearly has a motive to create anger. There's no sympathy for the other side of the argument. And it's an agenda to justify the actions of the KKK. Maybe the purpose is to raise membership of the group. So these issues might well affect whether or not we see the source as useful. So at this point, we probably have we'd have to have a paragraph at the end or a few lines summarizing our thoughts with regards to the usefulness. And we then try to conclude saying that one source is more useful than the other, but of course, given evidence why. For example, we said the first source should quite a balanced perspective. We said it should be based on factual research and details, whereas the second source clearly has an inbuilt agenda, clearly has an element of hatred and anger. Its tone is one of disharmony. That was a typical question 4. Now I want to spend a few minutes on an essay question. Consumerism was the main cause of the growth of the US economy during the 1920s. Do you agree? Now, if we look at this question carefully, a few little key words jump out at us, I'm sure. First of all, was it the most important? Well, clearly, if I spend 20 minutes of my life discussing consumerism without answering whether it was the most important, or I haven't engaged the question by discussing other factors, my mark may not be as strong as I would wish it to be. And of course, we'd have to concentrate on consumerism. How is that important? How does that cause the boom? Is it the main cause? Or the other causes, we could argue? And of course, in the third point, how important is it, including judgment and reasoning? Is it really that important in relation to other key factors? So I've quickly drawn up a few reasons why you could argue that consumerism is a vital cause of the boom. And what do we have? People buying on credit causes a boom in consumerism. People buying on hire purchase and paying with a deposit and installments meant that more expensive items could be bought over time instead of saving and saving and saving and saving. More disposable income for many people, or for some people, of course. In particular, in the cities, in the northern cities, you might have higher wages, but also due to reduced taxes, you have more disposable income. Many goods were mass produced and standardized. So as a result, the unit prices were reduced, so more affordable. Perhaps the consumerism is linked to the protection policy by the Republican Party in the 1920s, where they imposed tariffs on goods arriving into the United States. The outcome of making American goods cheaper as opposed to non-American goods, and thus more attractive and desirable. So consumerism is caused by these factors, and it leads to a rise in profitability of these companies. Maybe it's about consumer goods have been advertised, the cinema and the radio, causing a rise in consumerism, a rise in profits, and thus having a positive impact on the economic growth. Electricity, being introduced in many houses at this time, caused the demand for electric goods, of course. Maybe it's about attitudes changing, causing the rise of consumerism. Remember, the answer is not about causes of consumerism, it's about features of consumerism and how this helps the economy to boom. Wages had gone up for certain groups in particular. Maybe it's about context, post-World War I era. Maybe it's because it's the jazz age, a time of excitement, a positive era in American history. So perhaps this explains why consumerism was the key cause, because it leads to profits being raised for companies, companies taking on more workers as a consequence, and a positive impact on other industries throughout this period. However, will that answer the question? Because surely you'd have to discuss other factors which contribute towards the economic boom or growth. Number of points I've raised here for you. Number one, World War I impacting on the American economy. For example, German industries were starting to fall behind, and America was able to catch up and actually overtake, for example, in the chemical industries. The war was a lengthy war for the European powers, in particular Britain and Germany, whereas America joined years later, as you know. Maybe America is in a strong position because of a richness in terms of natural resources, like labor and timber and land. Maybe the economic policies help cause this. I've mentioned tariffs, but also laissez-faire, the idea of freedom, economic freedom. The confidence as a result of this. Maybe it's about investment, share price purchases to improve the companies, which then results in a knock-on effect on the economy. Maybe the car industry, which we mentioned in question 1, has a major impact. For example, the multiplier effect, affecting other industries. The use of mass production helped revolutionize methods of production in the United States, which I then mentioned in the next point. So maybe two-sided approach with plenty of detail as such would be a great way to answer the question. So I've discussed the main feature first, then I've discussed other features which help cause the boom, and then I'd have a judgment at the end of the response. Now, if you remember, I also mentioned there was another bonus question I would go through if needed. So I'm going to spend 2 or 3 minutes on the final question, the final question 1. Using the source and your own knowledge, describe life in Nazi Germany during the 1920s. So, of course, from the source, I can pick out a number of points. Without repeating myself too much, the main positives were people could buy cars via the KDF scheme. Although many people, as you know, did not have the car delivered to them, and they wasted their money in this savings scheme. Many people had holidays abroad, or some people had holidays abroad, but of course that was if they were Nazi party members. Many people had benefits of the KDF scheme, as I mentioned earlier, theatre trips, adult classes, walks in the mountains, etc. But now I'm going to focus on my own knowledge for the next 2 minutes. What else could I bring in terms of life in Nazi Germany? So now we start thinking, right, what are my categories in my mind? Who can I discuss? By the way, I think you just noticed that I put in the question, life in Germany in the 20s. That was, of course, the 1930s, so I do apologise for that rare error. So other examples from our knowledge about life in Germany. You might discuss Aryan children, where some enjoyed the macho lifestyle of the Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth. Some enjoyed the adventure, camping, war games, for example, long hikes in the countryside. Some would say that the many youth enjoyed the alternative education, a more macho and accessible examples of education. You might discuss the positives to German women, for example, the Motherhood Cross, which some people did support because it was seen as a reward for raising the birth rate of Nazi Germany. You could say that other examples would have been the Aryan Germans now removing themselves from unemployment. But of course, as you know, this was often as the result of persecution of minority groups, who then would be classed as invisible unemployment, but at the benefit of Aryan males, of course. You might discuss the enjoyment some German people had, for example, in the Olympic Games in 1936, and the support for sports like boxing. You might say that some members of the church were satisfied that the church was able to survive, unlike under a communist rule, for example, in the Soviet Union. So I think in conclusion, we ended on a good question there, where we utilized what was in the source for content, then we added in extras from our knowledge, didn't we, to expand on how lives changed during the 1930s, not the 20s, 1930s. So I'd like to think then, as time now enters its closing stage, we had a lot of information there, and this clearly benefited your source evaluation skills. Thank you very much.